John Clarke, a social worker who assists whistleblowers, as well as Patrick Maduna, a whistleblower himself, join me to talk about this anniversary. And good morning to you both. I know that it's a sad day in some ways as well. And we had our reporting team outside Babita Deokaran's home, and you can see that the pain obviously is still very close and to the skin for their family members. But the only way that justice is achieved is if those who, beyond those, the killers themselves having been convicted and getting those sentences, those who masterminded all of this are brought to justice. And I'm wondering, maybe, John, we can kick off with you, as we heard from the SIU's Andy Motibe this morning, that the corruption networks at Tembisa Hospital seem to be far more exponential than what Babita was trying to, trying to blow the whistle on, that it might even extend to other hospitals across the country. When you hear things like this, even though it's 3 years later and we don't know who the masterminds are, her death was not in vain.
It wasn't. And I mean, Jeff Wicks, in his extraordinarily good investigating afterwards, made darn sure that he would continue the work that she started. And in Mandy Wiener's book, A Whistleblower, she produced an updated edition where she includes a chapter on Babita Deokaran, and she describes her as being an island in a sea of corruption. And it's wonderful that she stood proud, despite the fact that there was and often with a death, and this is really my experience as a social worker, all crises are latent opportunities. And what we have seen is a galvanizing of people to actually say, what sort of country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a mafia state where people get away with this? No, what we have seen is a media rallying, and thanks to folk like yourself, we've managed to get it. I would like to have heard, Advocate Motibe acknowledge that, that the SIU can now justly say, good, we're making progress, but they would never have done it if it wasn't for the media and civil society and ordinary people who are just taking responsibility, who should, many of whom, be in witness protection themselves, as Babita should have. So there's an issue there. The fact that what she was disclosing and was such incendiary information, the SIU should have made sure she was in witness protection, and I have Patrick here today, who I believe also should be in witness protection, and he can tell you his story. But the essence of it is that we can roll back this mudslide and we make meaning out of the tragedy of what Babita and her family had to experience. And
I think that's key. What you're saying is that there has to be some level of meaning. We have to feel a sense, I mean, not that it was worth it, because nothing can ever be worth the price tag of a life, but that it was worth it in the sense that her efforts were not fruitless. And I want to then bring it to you, Patrick. Maybe you can just share, just as an opening, how this case, how the developments in this case resonate for you as a whistleblower yourself.
Absolutely. So I think 2016, Barloworld and Shell and Avis came together. They created a BEE, so sort of an empowerment program, which I was included in, and I became a trustee, only to find that this is just a vehicle that was designed to defraud Shell, which I then made, protected disclosures to Shell South Africa, Shell Global, the Hawks, the BE Commission, as well as Lokiwe itself. Then I was retaliated. I got, a lot of charges. I went to disciplinaries until I was fired, and also took bullets. And as we speak, my car is a bullet hole at the back. So,
well, as John is saying, you should be in a protective program. You should be in some form of witness protection. We've seen the brutality and the risk that is attached to not being in such a program. How are you feeling when you think about your experience in relation to what happened to Babita?
Unfortunately, that's the reality. When you confront the powers, they retaliate, and this is their best way of retaliating.
Well, just to stay on that point for a second, because we don't want to have a conversation later on that, more should have been done. John, who needs to be galvanized to make not only the recommendation in terms of Patrick's security a reality and come to fruition, but for others like Patrick, and we know that there are many. I mean, Mandy's written about them in her book, but we know in South African society that there are many people who are now exposed. I mean, first of all, they've lost their livelihoods. They've been outed, and they're vulnerable, as are their families, but they should be protected.
They should, and they should be not just their lives, but their livelihoods. But let's stay with the issue of their lives and their well-being and their safety. I mean, we've had to now go overseas to get funding to support Patrick and his family because he can't get a job. And we've had to duck and dive to make sure he's safe, move around to different locations so they don't know where he is. Now, 4 years after Mandy published her first edition of the book, we had assumed that the Protected Disclosures Act was just a kind of 6 months away of being totally overhauled, a far more effective agency established to ensure that what myself and others are doing as civil society volunteers often would be taken on as a state responsibility. We still have not had the overhaul of the PDA, and that is a mark of absolute shame. However, I always try
So whose door do we lay that at?
Well, on the state, because of course these criminal networks are so well sort of networked into basically retarding any movement, because blowing the whistle, and whistleblowers are the most effective way of actually getting to the heart of corruption, particularly in financial crimes.
So this is justice and constitutional development, right?
Exactly.
This should be
constitutional development, justice,
right.
constitutional development.
Yeah.
And I had run-ins with the former Deputy Minister, John Jeffries, but I did talk to Songezo Zibi before the elections, and he said he was going to promise to mount a private members bill, and he has hoped that by the end of this year, he would have had a petition mounting with 1 million signatures to make sure that the PDA is overhauled. Now, Songezo, if you're watching, remember that promise you made. I know you've got other priorities, but I can't see a more important one if we're going to clean up the mess and if the government of national unity is to survive. Because that whole thing requires
political
honesty and truthfulness.
Yeah.
And if we have whistleblowers that we know can actually expose that, politicians will be deterred somewhat from basically trying their luck.
And I mean, we heard from Advocate Andy Motibe from the SIU this morning that there's an opportunity to have the proclamation, insofar as Tembisa Hospital is concerned, widened to include other hospitals across the country, because it sounds as if this is not an isolated incident. And when you think, Patrick, about just how sophisticated all of this seems to be, I mean, it was way more than Babita could ever have envisaged. I think the figures run into the billions, 3 billion. We're talking about more than 5,000 transactions, letterbox companies, trying to wash money and so on, that it becomes quite complex. From your vantage point, I mean, how different is it, when you're scratching the surface to the real rot that you're exposing underneath? Just talk to our viewers about how intentional and how sophisticated, in your experience, these networks are. This is their business, to take money.
Unfortunately, I think I'm actually saying unfortunately intentionally, because the corporate, they employ very, very educated people, very, very skilled people, and those who are in power, those who are given power to make the rules and govern, are the ones who are the most corrupt. But unfortunately, we are scapegoated in the process. So I feel we are very, very vulnerable to an extent that if you don't have people who will hold your hand, like John did to me, you can easily commit, suicide if you are not killed. The situation is very, very dire, and your family suffers, and you suffer, and everything around you suffers. If it wasn't for the Whistleblower House and the Freedom House in America, I think I would be in a very, very dire situation. I wouldn't be here as well.
And that's really sobering, Patrick, to hear you say that, because, we often write it in black and white, and that's often devoid of emotion. But the cost to a life, to a family, to your children, to your opportunities is massive. And so it's really, I think, heartening to hear that there is a network of support around people like yourselves. Still ahead, we'll continue this conversation looking at 3 years since Babita Deokaran was killed outside her home after blowing the whistle on corruption in the Gauteng Health Department. We'll have more. Do stay with us.